Okay, in this demo, I will be configuring a CloudFront distribution, and I'll do that using the AWS Management Console. So CloudFront, of course, is Amazon Web Services solution for a content delivery network. In other words, caching content from an origin location somewhere like S3 or an app running through Elastic Load Balancer. And by having that cached, and you can specify what gets cached, like large media files, this means it's available on edge servers near users that might request it. They don't have to wait for the network response time to grab something from an origin server that might be on a different continent. Instead, they could pull it from the nearest edge CDN server for CloudFront. So here in the console, I'm going to search for CloudFront, and I'm going to click that to get started. So what you do is you create a CloudFront distribution. Now, you might configure multiple CloudFront distributions for different origin sources or for different behavior characteristics, such as how long things stay cached, whether they're compressed, that type of thing. I'm going to choose Create a CloudFront distribution, and the first thing we have to deal with is where is the content coming from? What's the origin domain? We have our Amazon S3 buckets shown here, and if we have any apps deployed through Elastic Load Balancer, we can select them. And if we've configured any media store or media package items in AWS, we can select them. So what I'm going to do here in this particular example is just choose a bucket called HQ Projects. I'm going to select that. So when requests come into the cache, if you want CloudFront to add another path to the origin domain name, you can add that here. So the name's been filled out for us. Now, in order for CloudFront, which is an AWS service, to talk to S3, it needs permissions, just like a user would need permissions to talk to the content in a bucket. So origin access identity, if you don't use that, that means the bucket has to be open for public access, and you might not want that. If you choose to use origin access identity, then you can either select or create a new identity for use in this purpose. In this case, it's just public content. So if the bucket allows public access, such as for public-facing web apps and product documentation, that type of thing, then we're good to go. If you need to customize the header information sent to the origin server from the CloudFront distribution, you can add headers and values here. Down under default cache behavior, we could then determine if we want to compress objects that are cached automatically, which is a good idea to save on storage space. If I want to allow, let's say, HTTPS only, I could turn that option on. We can also specify a cache policy and an origin request policy. There's one that's selected here automatically. It's recommended for S3 origins. But if you were to click View Policy, you'll see some settings here like time to live. How long can things stay in the cache? The minimum, maximum, and the default value. 86,400 seconds equates to the number of seconds in a 24-hour time period. So the number of seconds in one day. However, I'm not going to make changes to that. When it comes to streaming content, under additional settings, if you're not using Microsoft IIS as a web server in the source for streaming, then you could choose to enable that option. This is one of those settings where you would have to try it with and without the setting to see if it actually makes a difference. Now, if you need to do some kind of processing on the edge cache servers, then you can go to function associations for certain types of requests that would trigger your code to run, whether it be a Lambda function or a CloudFront function. So with viewer requests, viewer responses, origin requests, origin responses. For example, with a certain type of viewer request, you might spawn a CloudFront function that might redirect them to another page, depending on the nature of the content in the request. Then down below under settings, I can use all edge locations around the world. Or if I know I only want to serve cached content to a user base in North America and Europe, for instance, I could choose that. If you are using the AWS Web Application Firewall, or WAF, you can associate it with this CloudFront distribution. Remember that a WAF is a web app-specific type of firewall that prevents or at least mitigates or reduces the impact of common web attacks like SQL injection attacks, directory traversals, cross-site scripting. You could also specify the default root object like a specific type of home page that would be returned when a request comes in for the root of a URL and not a specific path in it. Now, I don't want my CloudFront cache to deliver content over IPv6 because I won't be using it, so therefore I'm going to turn that functionality off. And finally, I'll click Create Distribution, which puts me into the properties of it, where I have all of the options that I've specified, and it's categorized, for example, under origins, and I could add additional origins. I'm not limited to just one. That's just what the wizard presents to me as I'm configuring it. I could also go to error pages and create custom error responses for specific types of HTTP codes, such as not found if, for example, a URL is specified for something that just doesn't exist server-side. I could even go to geographic restrictions. I could click Edit, and I could have an allow or a block list. So maybe an allow list for specific countries that I select from here. Maybe if you want to make sure that the content served up from cache makes sense for the target audience, whether it's a certain language or with specific cultural references, that type of thing. The other thing that's important back under the General tab is the CloudFront distribution domain name. In order to use cached content, you would refer to content using that distribution name. Of course, you might use a custom PKI certificate if you wanted to change that type of behavior over HTTPS. I'm going to go ahead and copy that name because I know that one of the things that we've done here in our distribution is we've pointed to an S3 bucket called HQ-projects. Here's the actual bucket content where we actually have a file called projectday.txt. It has its own object URL that I could copy. Now, when I try to connect to it in another web browser tab, it says access denied, and that's because, remember, public access has to be enabled the way we've configured our distribution. So I'll go back to my HQ projects bucket, permissions, and I will edit the block public access, and I'll turn that off, and I'll save the changes. Of course, it wants me to confirm that, so I have to type in the word confirm, make sure there's no sensitive data in this bucket. Now, don't forget, just besides not blocking public access, depending on your bucket configuration, there might be a policy. So in the bucket properties under permissions, I've got a bucket policy here that allows all service principals to retrieve S3 objects for this given bucket. And that's why now, when I refresh the web page, I can now read the content of that file. But I'm not talking to it through CloudFront. I'm using the origin URL. I'm going to copy that DNS domain name again. And basically, that's going to be the prefix before /project_a.txt. Notice that when I refer to it using the CloudFront URL, we still get the same content because it's part of what's configured as the origin for our CloudFront distribution, and thus it is cached.